lot of things went on in the 80s.
The evil empire.
Ethiopia.
Seeing the wall come down.
Yuppies.
Greed.
AIDS.
Breakdancing. Big hair.
Party.
Rap. Reagan. Spandex.
I think of the 80s as pure mayhem.
The decade of excess.
The give me the money decade.
The 80s meant MTV.
Image was everything.
If you were to make a generalization about the 80s, it would be summed up with new wave.
To try to summarize a decade of the 80s, it was kind of like a glam slam metal jam.
80s is the hip-hop generation. We took over the world with hip-hop in the 80s.
The 80s is legendary.
It's the first time I was aware of a decade even being a decade.
Just a 10-year roller coaster ride of over-the-topness.
Should I Stay or Should I Go was not just a punk anthem of the early 80s. It was also the question plaguing the anti-establishment music. The answer was, of course, to stick around. But if punk was going to survive, it needed to evolve into something more accessible, or in the spirit of the 80s, more commercial. I'm Shannon Doherty, and in this hour, VH1 presents the 80s. We will look at the rise of new wave and the roots of alternative rock.
Punk rock began in the 1970s as a music of youthful working-class rebellion. The music was big in England, but American punk bands never found chart success.
I belong to the blank generation, and I can take it or leave it each time.
By 1980, punk was at a crossroads. Some punk bands went underground. Others changed course and created an eclectic sound called new wave. New wave was easier to listen to than punk, and the rebellion it encouraged was possible even for suburban kids.
Shake it up. Shake it up.
But under the radar, punk was alive and kicking. By the mid-80s, new wave was over, and a fresh punk-driven music surged through small clubs, opening the door for the alternative rock explosion of the early 90s.
Take it, Diddy.
The punk scene that came out of the late 70s was straightforward, simple songs that were played with a lot of passion and not necessarily with a lot of ability.
Hey, oh, let's go. Hey, oh, let's go. Fun in the backseat.
In the mid-70s, the punk scenes of New York and London reduced rock to its most basic sounds. Fast drums, simple guitar, loud vocals. Punk pierced the tongue of the reigning musical establishment, the expensive concerts and preening rock stars of the 70s.
Compared to sort of like, you know, the Doobie Brothers or the Eagles, it was such a raw sound and it was so uneasy.
I am an anti-Christ. I am an anarchist.
By 1980, punk had failed to catch on with a pop audience, and most of punk's pioneers had burned out or self-destructed.
Trying to forget your generation.
The groups were supposed to destruct, really. That was the very nature of punk.
20, 24 hours to go. I want a piece of it.
I think punk in the late 70s didn't survive through the 80s just because the basic premise of it is not to sell out, you know? And the fact is, when it does become commercial and all the bubblegummers like it, change it because it ain't punk rock.
Even punk's originators found the form restrictive.
I fought the law won.
What you said, the way that you said it, the clothes you wore, the purists were really trying to freeze the music.
The punk ethic became a completely rigid, sterile uniform, everybody looking exactly the same way, all marching to the same beat, tra-la-la-la-la, very dull.
One band was determined not to sound like everyone else and moved beyond the limits of punk.
The band for the 70s into the 80s, to me, the band was really the Clash as far as what came out of punk rock that cracked the mainstream, but for good reason. The Clash took their music and kept changing it and boldly experimented. It's the band U2 wishes they could be.
Formed in England in 1976, The Clash produced socially conscious, sonically abrasive music. In 1980, the band's double album, London Calling, became a surprise commercial success in the U.S.
Thankfully, we had another home in America where people weren't so up themselves about whether it was punk or wasn't it. You know, they could just see, hey, this is a good rock group. So we could kind of escape the very constricting British punk scene, and that freed us up a lot.
London Calling broke the rules of punk by combining elements of reggae, rockabilly, and R&B with punk's passion and speed.
At the time of London Calling, punk, up until then, like punk music was like painting itself into a corner. We attempted to show that we could play any type of music.
With 1982's top 5 hit, Rock the Casbah, The Clash came closer to pop stardom than any punk band at that time.
The Clash cracked that mainstream. They even got into bright clothes, but they still kept some of their punk following. Like you listen to Rock the Casbah. It's not as raw as the first Clash album, but it sure is good.
Still, some of punk's critics viewed The Clash's success as a betrayal.
We couldn't take a lot of that punk stuff too seriously because it got ridiculous. It became a parody of itself. Guys were singing about being so angry and so pissed off, and they're earning all this money. And we were like, that's weird for a punk band.
Should I stay or should I come? If you say that you are mine, I'll be here till the day I die.
By the mid-'80s, the band's founding members had split. As The Clash were trying to broaden the horizons of punk, some of the U.S. punk groups were evolving and gaining acceptance.
We went from a real sort of punk, 3-chord wonder kind of, real up-tempo stuff to a different kind of feel. That was part of our success. I mean, basically, if we hadn't experimented and crossed different styles of music, we wouldn't have had Heart of Glass. We wouldn't have had Rapture. I mean, we wouldn't have done some real groundbreaking things.
I think that we were surprised that we got as popular as we did, but when we did, we never wanted that to stop the idea of constant innovation.
And you may find yourself living in a shotgun shack.
As bands like Blondie and the Talking Heads made the transition into the 80s, their music got a new name.
Well, how did I get here?
When American radio stations said punk rock, we won't play that, Seymour had a little brainstorm and he said, I'll call it New Wave.
Seymour Stein, the president of Sire Records, had signed several of the New York punk groups in the 70s. In the 80s, he helped usher these bands to the masses.
I felt the punk thing was damaging, and I just felt that there was a whole new wave coming in. It was very left of center at the time, but I've always felt that the best of the esoteric music of one period can very often become the pop music of the next.
The whole idea of the music industry turning a page and actually getting behind these bands, it left the idea of being counterculture and became marketing.
It worked very well, because suddenly, just overnight, we went from being a punk band to being a new wave band. We also got played on the radio after that.
While punk turned off some listeners, it turned on young musicians. Bands of the early 80s gained courage from punk, the confidence to start a band with more attitude than musicianship. As those bands matured, they helped define the 80s sound. When we return, New Wave comes into its own.
New Wave, very, very song-driven, and a lot of the music was really based around these really great hooks.
And the Police leave punk behind. When VH1 presents the 80s continues.
Punk music rebelled against the establishment. You could hear it in the sound and see it in the defiant look. While young bands of 80s new wave admired punk style, they weren't as interested in the politics.
Oh, you're a punk band.
No way, we're not punk, we're new wave.
I didn't know there was a difference.
Come on, there's a whole different attitude to the music, man. Punkers are into an angry thing. New wave, hey, we're just having fun with it.
In the early 80s, New Wave was introduced as a marketing term to distance new bands from 70s punk, which seemed too rough and confrontational for American audiences.
I say whip it. Whip it good.
Eventually, New Wave developed its own identity, and the term was used to distinguish both bands who came out of the punk scene and bands who borrowed elements of punk and made it more accessible.
We just knew that punk rock was going to change the world. You could imagine how disgruntled we all were when New Wave came along. The Knack, that was the first one I remember. The Knack. God, all my punk friends were up in arms.
I think the Knack was cool, but it was, it was definitely not God Save the Queen.
New Wave means it's cat. New Wave means it's pussyfooting. Can't go all the way there, but wants to go halfway there, but hasn't got the guts to go the whole way. So New Wave just made us vomit on the floor.
That's what I like about you. That's what I like about you.
Unlike punk, New Wave mirrored the affluent 80s, producing music that was flashy, apolitical, and escapist.
Turning up and turning down, I'm turning in, I'm turning right, I'm turning Japanese. I think I'm turning Japanese, I really think so.
I think the new wave bands probably reached a bigger audience than the punk bands because the message in their music was a lot more pop-oriented. A lot of the punk music was, a lot more political.
Sucker. I know what boys like. I know what guys want. I know what boys like me.
Life has got a few more things to offer than just pure aggression against the status quo. When you really love music, you find a lot of other emotions or modes that you want to express yourself in. So punk becomes a little bit limiting.
Things changed not because people wanted, say, something not as edgy, but the new wave thing evolved. It was more melodic in a different sense, but it was still edgy.
That was a good time. Yeah. I got pretty good.
I think it comes down to the old questions of accessibility and melody. New Wave was very, very song-driven, and a lot of the music was really based around these really great hooks.
We never made any claim that we didn't love pop music. Our music right from the beginning was always a blend of pop and punk. And we weren't the only ones doing that.
What I was trying to do was I was trying to take all the anger, all that kind of the hurly-burly nature of punk rock, the kind of, ramble-tamble, the kind of cacophony of noise, and to expand the horizons of the music.
Sink another drink, 'cause it'll give me time to think. If I had a chance, I'd ask a woman to dance, and I'll be dancing with myself.
I used the springboard of the change between punk rock the 80s music to do that.
Basically, if you couldn't cut it in punk, you had a good chance of cutting it in new wave. Adam Ant is a perfect example. Adam Ant started off as a punk. He was a terrible punk rocker. Then he moved on to new wave. And he did the same thing, the prancing, the mincing, the jumping around, the high-pitched yelps, and it was excellent.
As post-punk bands experimented with musical identities, one band invented a bold signature sound.
When I first heard The Police, I thought this is a band that's going to be around for a while. They just jumped out of the radio.
I'll send that SOS to the world. I hope that someone gets my message in the hearts of the world.
In London in the mid-70s, Stuart Copeland, Andy Summers, and Sting formed The Police and started performing in local punk clubs.
The whole scene was very vibrant, but the music kind of left me a little cold. But Stuart said, this is the way to go. So I thought I can play with that kind of energy, and we'll just hide our ability. We weren't the greatest punk group, and I think the press figured out fairly early that we were imposters.
We knew too much. Not that you shouldn't know much, but I think it's when you know a certain amount, it's hard to keep yourself in this narrow straitjacket. But I think then the Police became more new wave, less punk.
By combining musical styles like reggae and jazz with Sting's strong melodies, The Police invented a complex brand of pop.
A lot of people refer to them as the Beatles of the 80s, you know, and I think it's a great point.
With 1983's Synchronicity, The Police had the #1 album and song in America. By now, the biggest act in the world, The Police set out on a stadium tour that left musical categories behind.
They were considered a punk or new wave band at the beginning, and they incorporated reggae into their music, and the way that whole thing evolved was pretty incredible to see it.
At the height of The Police's success, the band split, with Sting moving on to pursue a solo career.
Well, Sting likes to say that it was Shea Stadium, which is where he realized that this is the pinnacle and there's no higher that we can go. We played our best show that night. It all came together that night. I don't think it's possible to achieve more of a nirvana.
Now, there's something rather thrilling about jumping off right at the high point of the curve. And as I look back on it now, I think it was a very, courageous move, which put a great deal of energy into the myth of the band, or the legend of the band.
The post-punk category of new wave freed up bands to try different styles and become better musicians. And as The Police showed, new rules meant that innovative groups could break out of small clubs and move to center stage. Coming up, new wave fashion makes a statement.
I like to stick out of the crowd because my mom doesn't like it.
And synth pop hits it big. When VH1 presents the 80s continues.
Although punk rock didn't really take off in America, there were plenty of disenfranchised kids looking to rebel in the 80s. Many were affluent suburban teens with little to rebel against, and new wave style gave them new ways to express themselves.
I'll stop the world and melt with you. You've seen the difference and it's getting better all the time.
By the early 80s, new wave had become a major force on radio and music television. Soon its influence had spread to popular fashion too, as ripped clothes and safety pins made their way into major department stores, sharing the racks with the more conservative styles of the 80s elite.
It was hilarious to see really high fashion people, you know, trying to sort of punk up and taking really expensive fabrics and ripping them up, you know. It made you laugh.
As new wave music came into its own, new wave fashion did too, developing its own characteristics that represented the fun and carefree nature of the scene.
I remember how sexy and attractive it was when it first started, like in 80, 81. It was a slightly more light-hearted approach towards punk style.
A lot of zippy stuff.
Thrift store suits, you know, skinny ties.
The new wave tie or the big button.
But then you also had the pirate thing.
The fluffy shirts, and it was the new romantic look.
The shoulder pads, the stiletto heels with the little white ankle socks.
Everything was really tacky, but it was really defined.
Hair gel, I mean, you couldn't be a new waver without hair gel or hairspray.
Flock of seagulls, that was a hairstyle.
Whereas punk was anti-establishment, new wave was chiefly a way for privileged kids to express their individuality in a way that was flamboyant but non-political.
We don't classify ourselves and we try to be individuals.
I want to be different, and I think I look good the way I dress.
I don't care what I think.
I just want to be different, and it's a lot more fun than being normal.
I like to stick out of the crowd, and because my mom doesn't like it.
Because I like to be different and antisocial.
Kids of the suburbs began defining themselves as new wave, getting the haircuts, wearing the clothes, and buying the records.
They got a word for girls like me. They got a name, but you don't want to use it. It's all the same for girls like me. It's all or nothing for girls like me.
It gave that generation coming up, you know, people who were in their late teens at that time, it gave them an identity. You know, they had movies being made about them and the way they felt, and then they had this whole new wave sound that went along with it, you know. So a monster was created, basically.
I think, you know, if you were to make a blanket generalization about the 80s, it would be summed up with new wave. And, you know, bands like Duran Duran and Flock of Seagulls, atmospheric synth pop that was fun to listen to, but that actually had some degree of substance to it.
New wave musicians made the most of the 80s technological advances, taking a special interest in the innovative possibilities of the synthesizer.
New wave was in favor of cheap and gimmicky innovations. It was kind of like the island of misfit toys. That's why synthesizer music caught on much faster in new wave than it did in rock in general.
In the 60s and 70s, synthesizers were mostly used by art rock bands, but by the early 80s, they had become accessible and easy to play.
The first keyboard that we bought was it was called a Wasp, and it cost $300, which really at the time was not a lot of money for a synthesizer. Every band could have one.
In the 80s, synth pop bands started springing up like punk bands did in the mid-70s.
You've grown up with rock music and guitars and stuff like that. Suddenly you're given a whole set of new toys, and it's a chance to make a mark in a different way.
Gary Newman had been playing punk guitar music under the name Tubeway Army, but by the late 70s, he abandoned his guitar for the synthesizer.
I went to a studio to make a punk album, and somebody had left behind a synthesizer from the session before, and I'd never seen a real one before, and it looked pretty cool. And luckily it had been set on a sound that was excellent, because I didn't know how to set them up or anything.
With the release of his hit single Cars in 1980, Newman set the standard for the decade's synth sound.
He was all synthesizers all the time, and he even sang like a synthesizer.
Here in my car, I feel safest of all. I can lock on my doors. It's the only way to live in cars.
The song Cars was pretty much about becoming a human synthesizer, and it was cold and distant and unfeeling, and yet it was indescribably sexy and intense and rocking. It was phenomenal.
The synthesizer worked very much like a punk instrument. A musician who had only played for a short time could sound as good as someone who played for 10 years.
How does it feel when you treat me like you do?
It was a sort of follow-on, you know, from that kind of punk DIY 3 chords thing. You know, it was just sort of very basic melodies, you know, quite repetitive. What I call sort of one finger playing. You know, it's like ding, 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 ding. It was almost like there was a sort of nursery rhyme quality to a lot of the kind of the riffs that you heard in those songs, like the Human League.
You were working as a waitress in a cocktail bar when I met you.
Before we had the hits, we used to get hauled into record company offices and sat down and they say, you will use a guitar, you will use a drummer. But yeah. We always agreed with them and then went away and did what we wanted. Our aim was always to have successful records using synthesizers and vocals only.
Don't you want me, baby? Don't you want me? Oh.
Frankly, I don't understand it. I don't know why anyone would want to see musicians playing. They're not very interesting.
But not everyone was impressed. Since rock's early days, purists charged that any technological advance diminished rock's human element.
People, so why should it be? You and I should get along so awfully.
During the 80s, we come up against a lot of brick walls with journalists and stuff, saying that what we were doing wasn't real, and we struggled quite a bit actually to keep our heads above water.
When synth bands became popular, fans of guitar rock claimed the music wasn't authentic.
I hate the synthesizer. I hated it at the time, I still hate it with a vengeance. It represents everything that's wrong with music. It's something that isn't made naturally. Some bastard hits a note that's been programmed by somebody else. It represents somebody else's thought.
No, because they've got to be played. I mean, ultimately, you've still got to have some guy or girl, you know, plugging them in and making them make noise.
In a western town, a dead-end world, the eastern boys and western girls.
I think the reason people thought it was cold is because we just didn't do it very well. But the machine itself was capable of brilliant expressions of emotion.
Although many synth bands continued to thrive throughout the 80s, New Wave didn't. It fractured into many styles and burned out. But just in time, a new crop of guitar bands emerged to capture the attention of college radio and underground music fans. Coming up, rebel rock from the indie underground.
The 80s for us was kind of like what was on the pop charts was what we were against.
And the band that took alternative to the pop charts. Next on VH1 Presents the 80s.
The new wave bands that dominated radio and MTV in the early 80s may have smoothed out the rough edges of punk, but punk's abrasive sound and rebellious spirit were kept alive by bands in an alternative music scene.
Kiss. During the 80s, you had a mass musical culture that had people like Lionel Richie and Phil Collins and Michael Jackson, Madonna and Prince. But at the same time, you had an underground developing in the 80s that a lot of people feel very emotionally connected to today.
80s indie alternative rock was beneath the radar of the mainstream. Nobody knows what was going on there, and there's a lot of activity there. and it was this slow boil of really heavy
On the surface, the 1980s seemed to be ruled by slickly produced pop music. But through the decade, another music scene developed underground. Its sound was angrier, grittier, and far more skeptical of commercial culture.
There's a few different versions of the 80s. There was the 80s I was living in, which was Black Flag, DOA, the Dead Kennedys, Social Distortion, Minor Threat, the Bad Brains. Then the 80s also means Michael Jackson, Thriller. It was what altitude you were flying at.
Music fans began to identify the overproduced sound of 80s pop with that decade's greed and deceptions. By contrast, the 80s alternative bands had a more emotional, elemental, and seemingly truer sound.
Drums didn't sound like drums, they sounded like explosions. And synthesizers were just all glossy and sheeny. And then you'd go to stuff like REM and the Pixies and Mission of Burma and Jane's Addiction and Husker Du, and it was much more organic. You know, guitars sounded like guitars, drums sounded like drums. It all seemed so stripped down.
Everybody just wanted to get back to the roots of music, and everybody wanted to be just raw. Raw was a big thing.
As it grew harder and harder for working people to make a living, a lot of people felt left out of the 80s party. Indie rock became a means to express pride in being an outsider and to recapture some of the ferocity of 70s punk.
The 80s for us was kind of like, we didn't really like anything. And what was on the pop charts was what we were against, if you will. We were moving sort of in the shadows and sort of opposed to anything that was popular or making money or anything like that.
The audience for this alternative music was a network of disillusioned kids who cared passionately about music.
I think the disaffectedness and the alienation of it was the gas that got poured on the fire. I mean, there was these people that had no outlet, and the more they got ignored, the louder we screamed, the louder we turned our guitars up, the more of a scene we wanted to make in our own little space.
We pretty much built our following on kids who were the geeks and the nerds and the freaks, the outcasts.
We were just like all those people with all those frustrations in the audience. We're coming from them, singing to them. It was folk music. So yeah, it totally connected.
Rather than waiting for the mainstream to deliver the music they wanted, some bands and fans adopted a do-it-yourself attitude.
It was this idea that you just would not passively accept whatever was rammed down your throat by the cultural or political establishment. You would actually take an active role in your life. It was very hard to find this music. It wasn't served up to you on a platter on MTV or commercial radio and things like that. You actually had to go out and investigate to find it.
Without the advantage of commercial radio or mainstream music publications, these bands had to look elsewhere for support.
Before anyone called anything alternative, it was college music, because the college radio stations were giving a little more exposure to music that you wouldn't necessarily hear on your local AC/DC station.
Take the skinheads bowling, take them bowling.
I think a lot of those bands found their audience through college radio and mom and pop record stores.
Nobody knew about it unless you were really part of it. You didn't read about it anywhere unless you put out a fanzine.
That's how we found out about bands on the East Coast. We'd read about the West Coast bands. Ooh, better buy that record. Read about it on Flip Side. It's got to be cool.
In the do-it-yourself spirit, smaller independent labels sprang up to meet the needs of this new music.
I think a lot of people started their own record companies, started selling their records, from town to town, going to record stores, trading off 10 singles for, $5 or something. You get enough gas to go to the next town and do that.
This ain't no picnic.
It sure seemed like an exciting alternative to, sort of the mainstream pop music. you know, the high gloss rock and roll show.
Walking around with your head in the clouds, it makes no sense at all.
While mainstream bands dreamed of MTV airplay and rock superstardom, alternative bands were emphatic on one subject. They were in it for the music.
I never had any idea of ever making money off music because we lived in a hovel, we played in grungy clubs, and we lived in a van.
We just said to him, you know, we're not going to get on the radio. You know, this stuff's too abrasive, and, you know, it's not aha.
Yeah, that's how sense it out.
Mainstream aspirations, radio airplay, and money were never part of the equation, ever.
Even though they never planned to be accepted by mainstream audiences, one alternative band had to face just that.
Suspicion yourself, don't get caught.
We don't live to be a critics band, or we don't strive to be a critics band. We don't strive to be a band, hardly. We just kind of are here.
Formed in Athens, Georgia in 1980, R.E.M. was the first band to show the commercial potential of the post-punk music adored by rock critics and college students.
College radio really did kind of make R.E.M. I mean, they picked up on us when all the big radio stations and all the big record stores really didn't want to have that much to do with us.
No one was doing anything like that. It was kind of irreverent and muddy and could care less, but really driving and cool.
In the train, doctor says, drive away, take a break.
Nobody can tell what the hell Michael Stipe is singing, but there was just something real about it. It wasn't slick and overproduced and packaged so much, you know. I always thought that was really cool.
By the end of the decade, R.E.M. had produced a top 10 single, signed to a major label, and graduated from the indie club circuit to arenas.
This one goes out to the one I love.
Fans of alternative music began as part of a small outsider community, but the bands they listened to would soon attract the attention of the mainstream. Eventually, they would change both the business and the sound of pop music. Coming up, indie bands on the verge of a pop breakthrough.
I was like, yeah, maybe we should be working with majors.
And the beginning of a musical revolution. Next on VH1 Presents the 80s.
In 1987, the stock market crashed. The national debt was growing. College graduates were suddenly faced with an uncertain economic future. The resulting pessimism found its way into alternative music, where angst-fueled rock paved the way for the early 90s grunge.
By the end of the decade, young Americans were told that they would be the first generation since World War II who wouldn't do as well as their parents.
I remember getting out of high school and feeling like, well, what the hell is there for me to do?
As the decade of excess ended, alternative music was more reflective of the tone of the times than what was currently on the pop charts. The unpolished post-punk sound tapped into the cynicism and frustration of the demographic that would become known as Generation X. Although 80s post-punk lacked commercial success, many bands established devoted followings and paved the way for the alternative explosion of the next decade.
Everybody's talking like a stormy weather. What's a man to do but work out whether it's true?
I think that alternative rock scene was not judged based on hit songs, based on the quantity of albums sold, but based on the intensity of the relationship between the artist and the audience.
As R.E.M. and other bands picked up momentum, major labels started to look at independent bands with interest.
I was like, yeah, maybe we should be working with majors. You know, maybe this is, you know, maybe we're bigger than all these bands that are supposed to be the biggest thing, you know.
Well, could you be the one? Could you be the one?
It started to change slowly. I mean, you know, and then it really started to get ahead of steam, and then they couldn't sign enough bands. By 87, 88, you know, the major labels had signed everybody up.
When alternative bands went to major labels, some predicted the music would suffer, but the move gave bands exposure and inspired new ones. This evolution would set the stage for the success of grunge in the 1990s.
By the late 80s, something was going to have to happen to reinvigorate rock and roll.
Yeah, at the end of the 80s, it was pretty obvious that everybody was getting sick of being oversaturated with, you know, hair bands. You know, it all started to look the same. It all started to sound the same.
You could feel it bubbling up in the late 80s as artists like Jane's Addiction and the Pixies started suddenly selling hundreds of thousands of albums, whereas alternative rock only a few years earlier was only selling tens of thousands.
In 1989, a Seattle band called Nirvana recorded their first album for $600. In the next decade, Nirvana and others would introduce the world to the powerful gut-level music that the indie scene had been developing through the 80s. In 1991, Nirvana's Nevermind bumped Michael Jackson off the top of the charts. For many alternative music fans, it seemed that they and their music had finally won.
It was more than time for that sound to be on the radio. It was more than time for that to be the prevailing musical sound.
In the 1990s, a new group of alternative bands cropped up in the wake of Nirvana's success. But true fans knew that these bands would have never gotten a hearing without the groundwork of their 80s predecessors.
Bands like The Replacements and Husker Du, I mean, they paved the road that we're all walking on now, you know?
No one expected punk to break out in the United States, but the alternative bands of the 80s channeled the energy of 70s punk and created a music whose influence reached into the next century, helping to define a generation.
You no longer need to tune to a hip college station to hear the sound of the 80s indie underground. What was considered alternative 20 years ago is now used to sell everything from cars to khakis. In the next hour, we will see how another musical movement grew from the underground to the top of the charts when we look at the decade in hip-hop and R&B. I'm Shannon Doherty, and I'll see you then.
Gone to the dark.